Well, I did ask the question, are you rambling around a large house? Is it just you or is it just the two of you? New data shows large numbers of four-beddy houses around the country are lived in by households with just one or two people. Census data reveals the percentage of homes with 4 bedrooms or more being lived in by one or two people are high. I'll just give you a few. Auckland, 27%, Wellington, 30%, Christchurch, 36%. But when we go out into the rural parts of New Zealand, even higher, 62%, Thames Coromandel, 56% in Kaikoura, 54% in Bulla, Central Otago, Westland, and 55% in the Mackenzie district. So people living in homes that are bigger than they need are sometimes blamed for restricting housing supply. A paper published in 2020 by Victoria University suggested there was a number of large dwellings more suitable to young and expanding families being underutilised by the older generation. And there could be a system of financial incentives and Kiwi Build style development to produce homes that might better suit these people. The paper also suggested the tax system created an incentive to stay in large houses in well-located areas in return for increases in equity. Now, there are almost 687,000 houses across New Zealand with 2 or more bedrooms spare and almost 550,000 with 1 bedroom spare. Informetrics chief forecaster Gareth Kiernan said the growth had largely been among people aged in their mid to late 60s and older, and he joins me now. Gareth, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Leah.
Are we blaming the boomers again, maybe, for this?
It looks a little bit like that, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
but when you look at the numbers, when you delve into them, it's fascinating over the last 30 to 40 years that, firstly, the number of people aged over 70 has lifted from 6.8% of the population to 11.5%. So there's been substantial increases, we know, with the population aging and people living longer. And the proportion of those people who are living in homes with 2 or more spare bedrooms is lifted from under 30% now sitting at about 57%. So that's more than half of those people are living with, plenty of spare bedrooms around the place. And it's a similar trend when you look at the sort of 65 to 69-year-olds as well. What is interesting when you look over the last 10 years or so, it does look like the numbers have stagnated a little bit and the lifts are not increasing to the same degree. But I think when you delve into the age profile, it's probably because younger people are under that much more financial pressure in terms of even trying to get into the housing market.
Yeah.
And so the sort of spare bedrooms that you might have had if you were, buying your first home and thinking about starting a family, maybe you're just sort of happy to get one with 1 or 2 bedrooms now and you worry about upsizing later on. So there is, I think, generational sort of equity issues really potentially at play here.
So we've got the, for better of a word, oldies staying in their family homes, it sounds like. I mean, is there anything really wrong with that? I mean, they could still have family that comes back over, to visit for holidays, the grandies. They still keep their big home.
Oh, and there's certainly, benefits around that. And particularly when you look at, you mentioned some of those sort of provincial or almost holiday areas such as Thames Coromandel and Mackenzie and Kaikoura. I can imagine that, a significant proportion of those homes are being, partly Airbnb'd or something like that as well. And so people will be utilising them. But the fact that you've got a similar trend, a nationwide trend, which will ultimately be being driven by those larger urban areas and rising sort of underutilisation there, does potentially cause issues when you've got younger people who are, wanting to get into the housing market. They're obviously in the larger urban centres because that's where most of the jobs are as well. And effectively being sort of priced or crowded out of the market by people who are staying in their family home for longer. They've got their independence, they've got the family that comes to visit. That's all well and good, but it does raise questions about just where, potentially the younger generation does end up living and how, accessible that is to their work situation.
Do you know, Gareth, I think a lot of older homes that were sitting on your quarter acre section, and they were the bigger houses we grew up in, I grew up in, a lot of them were also bought up by property, developers, especially in the big centres, and bowled, and then then they popped up 5, 10 two-beddies or one-beddy apartments. I think that's where a lot of the big houses, when they did sell, didn't go to, first home buyers or young couples wanting to start families, sadly. They went to property developers.
Yeah, and look, I mean, there's a place for those sort of smaller townhouses. In fact, I'd argue as housing has continued to get more expensive over the last couple of decades, what we have seen is a bit of a change in people's preferences around housing as well, because, once upon a time, your Kiwi dream was, like you say, the quarter acre and a three-bedroom house.
Yeah.
That's right. Whereas now people, they're much more willing to accept the sort of townhouse or terraced house with not much yard, as long as some green space down the road for them that, they can utilise with their family potentially. It's maybe not their first choice, but it is still a viable living option. But one of the other dynamics is that with older people as well, I think if you went back 30 years and looked whether they were choosing to retire, a lot of people would, move off to Tauranga or the Kapiti Coast or Timaru. When you look at the sort of population movements from 30 years ago and the age profile of the population, people are not choosing to do that so much now. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but there is much more of a desire from people, I think, to also retire amongst their friends and families and stay a lot of the time in some of those urban areas, which, creates pressures of its own, but it also means that there's not that catalyst for, moving and probably downsizing while you're at it. People don't, they're attached to their property and they want to stick with it. And if they can, maintain it and look after it, then it means that they're continuing to use it, but probably not as much or as well as it should be used.